Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to the Irish Bioenergy Association webinar number 14. My name is Sean Finan, and I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. I'd like to begin by wishing you all a happy new year and best wishes for 2021. This morning's webinar will address the topic of wood fuels and air quality. So I'll just share my opening slides with you. So this morning's topic is addressing air quality concerns using dry wood fuels. And before we begin, just a very brief introduction to the Irish Bioenergy Association. As I know, this morning we have a number of first-time attendees to our webinar series. We were established in 1999 and work on behalf of the biomass, biogas, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels and energy crop sectors. Our main work is associated with policy, lobbying and advocacy, and we have a broad and diverse membership. And we also roll out and run a number of research projects and demonstration projects, including the 3C project, our EIP Small Biogas Demonstration Project, and we also roll out the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme. And further details are available at erbia.org. And also we are a membership organisation, so we are open to new members always, and anyone that is interested in becoming a member, feel free to get in touch with us. And our objective as an organisation is to work towards a sustainable energy future with bioenergy. So this morning's webinar we'll hear from Noel Gavigan. Noel is the Erbia Technical Executive, and Noel will give a presentation on the particular topic that's our focus this morning. And following that, we will answer any questions that you may have, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. This is webinar number 14. We started in the middle of last year. The series has run successfully, and we intend to continue with the series on Wednesdays fortnightly from 9:30 to 10:30. And all the previous webinars and recordings are available on our website, www.erbia.org. And we are planning our series now for 2021. And if you would like to get involved, feel free to contact myself, or indeed Teresa O'Brien, whose email address is there, teresaobrien@erbia.org. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Teresa for her work behind the scenes in getting all of this set up and ensuring that the webinars run smoothly on a fortnightly basis. Our next webinar will take place on the 27th of January from 9:30 to 10:30, and we're currently just finalising on our speaker and topic, and that will be published through our social media channels in the coming days. So a brief introduction to this morning's webinar. Our focus is around air quality, and there's been a lot of focus on this particular area in recent weeks and months, and it's particularly associated with the burning of solid fuels. Our focus as an organisation is on wood fuels, while the solid fuel discussions also focus on turf and peat and coal and a wide variety of other solid fuels. Last year, the narrative and media discussion around solid fuels linked all wood to other fossil fuels. So during the course of last year, Erbia, through a variety of methods, including press releases, including letters, including statements and various communications, we managed to successfully change the narrative so that there's a clear distinction now being made in the discussion between wet and dry wood fuels. And this is very, very important and is the main focus of our discussion this morning. Today's webinar will outline from an air quality and emissions perspective the difference and the impact of wet and dry wood fuels, and Noel will outline the various research that is available, which clearly demonstrates the link between moisture contents and emissions/air quality. As I mentioned earlier, Erbia rolls out the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme, and our Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme members are producing dry wood fuels at a very high standard and quality, which are certified, and further information on the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme can be reached through www.wfqa.org. We'd like to acknowledge the ongoing support of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine to promote the WFQA, and this webinar will also outline our ongoing campaign within the organisation for the introduction of regulation of the moisture content of wood fuels, so that we can eliminate wet wood fuels from the market and address concerns regarding air quality and particulate emissions. Our speaker this morning is Noel Gavigan. Noel is the technical executive with Arbia. Noel manages and administers the wood fuel quality assurance scheme and has extensive experience over 10 years working with the organisation and with members in the areas of biomass, biogas, biofuels, wood fuels, energy crops and biochar areas. So that concludes my introduction, and I now hand over to Noel, who will take you through his slides and presentation. And feel free, as I said, to submit your questions through the Q&A tab, and we will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible at the end of Noel's presentation. And thanks again for joining us. So Noel, can you share your slides? And
I can. Thanks very much, Sir Sean. One moment.
And if you just go to presentation mode.
I trust you can see the first page there now.
Just go to presentation mode.
Yeah. Can you see front page there now?
It's just, yes, now we can see it. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Sorry. Now we may have some difficulty with signal this morning. We have a lot of schools using Zoom. We've noticed once they've reopened this week that the signal can be a little bit choppy, but we'll muddle through and get to show you this. So what we're looking at here is there are a number of concerns, as Sean has outlined, and in terms of air quality in our urban areas, and not so much in rural areas, but really there's a focus looking at what fuels we're using now and what we're going to do to address those concerns. And it's not just about the fuels, it's also about appliances, and this is not an issue that's unique to Ireland. It's something that's been looked at a European level and indeed at a worldwide level. So the concerns really circulate around two areas, and that's the emissions of particulate matter and of NOx, nitrous oxides. In the particulate matter, remember 20 years ago, all the discussion was around PM10, which is basically particulates with a diameter of 10 microns and under. Whereas now the debate or the science has moved on to PM2.5. So we're really looking at the smaller particles. And the reason they're an issue is that they can be absorbed directly. They've always been there, and we just hadn't the technology to measure them many years ago when we were measuring PM10. But now we have the technology, we're able to assess the PM2.5, and the issue is that they can be absorbed directly into the bloodstream under certain conditions, and obviously have kind of health implications. So they're produced from the combustion of liquid and solid fuels. So obviously we are all familiar with the diesel engine issue that happened a couple of years ago. And obviously solid fuels, which have always been around, from coal, turf, P-type products and firewood. And essentially what particulate matter is, it's tiny pieces of unburnt particles. And it is them that effectively are the issue. So to address that, clearly there's two ways of doing it. Number one, that there isn't any unburnt particles, that you've got complete combustion. And the second is that you may look at filtering processes as well. I already outlined that where the health effect issue on that. In terms of NOx, nitrous oxides have a number of effects. One of them is that they react with sunlight to produce smog. They are a severe irritant to the lungs and kind of a detrimental impact on people, in particular those that are suffering already from underlying illnesses to do with the respiratory system. And they also would have effects on the biosphere. So now really what we're looking at there is adding in nitrogen into the local environment can have an impact on sensitive ecological sites. And that is something that does need to be looked out for. So it's not just a human issue, it's also an issue for ecology. So it's something that has relevance to both on those. Recently, no, about 2 years ago, this report was completed by the EPA, and I'll just go into some of the factors of some of the science behind this, some of the research that has been done on emissions so far. And the EPA commissioned the UCD to do a piece of work about 2 years ago. It was finished. It's a very interesting piece of work. It's very well put together. And essentially, what they done on UCD, you see that stove on the right-hand side, that they use that single stove to test a range of different solid fuels that are available on the market. and they tested the emissions directly from those fuels under combustion under standard conditions. So it was well done piece of research in that they concentrated on using a single appliance. There was no other factors changed within the research. So it was looking at all fuels in one. Now, we would have a slight issue with that, and I'll go into that, or we have a predominant issue with that, in that wood wouldn't tend to burn very well in these types of stoves. But having said that, from a scientific point of view, the research was well carried out, and the stove type is quite similar to what many people would have. In that study, they compared turf, coal, different types of coal, bituminous and other, dry and low smoke coal, dry firewood, wet firewood, and peat briquettes. Again, as I said, they use a single multi-fuel stove for all tests. It was excellently done. The piece of research is very usable. It's something that we can, they can stand over, and it is something that has added significantly into our knowledge in this area. We would, however, say that it is limited in scope, as it only looked at one stove and one design of stove, and I'll outline later on why that's important. So that would be the only limiting factor we would see with that piece of research. The results of that, this is the last slide I'm going to show you from that, but it's a comprehensive report. If this is an area you have strong interest in, I would advise you have a look at it. The results of that, you can see the various different fuels on the right-hand side here. So you've got sod peat, peat briquette, coal. You can use your color coding there just to give a quick eye glimpse of what's going on. I'll explain the factors of the graph in a second. The soaked wood, which is a wet firewood, is in blue, and then the dry firewood, the hardwood and the softwood, they don't actually say what moisture content the wood was at, as far as I can recall, but you can see there in green here in a group down at the bottom. Now, they looked at those two emission factors in this study. They looked at particulate matter, which is on the vertical axis, and they looked at nitrous oxides, which is on the horizontal axis. And effectively, basically, the further away you are away from zero, the worse the fuel is in terms of emissions. So the higher up you are here, the more particulates you're producing, and the further over you are to the right, the more nitrous oxides you're producing. Now, what was quite interesting on that was that you can see the dry firewood all clumped down here in the bottom left-hand corner, which is the area which is where you want everything to be. So it did compare extremely well in this study, despite some limitations, which I'll discuss later on, but it did perform very well. So we were happy to see that in the context of the research that was carried out. The limitation of it was this was using a multi-fuel stove, and as I'll explain later on, a multi-fuel stove is not the best appliance for burning firewood. It is a jack of all trades in many ways. It'll burn that whole range of fuels, but it is not the most efficient or indeed the cleanest way of burning wood fuel. But it is in all the same a very good piece of research, and as you can see, the results are quite stark in terms of, you can see most of our peat products over here, highest in nitrous oxides, a range in terms of particulate matter, some very low and some very high. So the peat briquettes, as you can see, tend to cluster down lower down, and sod peat, turf basically, tends to have the highest in particulate matter. And then your coal products here, you can see the smokeless coals come in that little bit better in terms of your main bituminous fuels. Quite a bit of a spread there across that. Now, another piece, and I'll just go through other pieces of evidence that are done. The CRAC report in 2017 again compared two different moisture contents, 16% moisture content and 28% moisture content. And it looked at those two moisture content timbers in two different types of appliances, an old insert stove and a modern stove. Now you can see straight away you get two very clear effects in that. Number one, the dry firewood in both situations produced less particulates, and then the modern stove also produced significantly less. But there is a dramatic impact when you look at an old stove burning wet firewood compared to the new stove burning dry firewood. You have a dramatic effect in terms of reducing particulate matter. So it's an interesting piece of research, and we've other evidence to show that as well. This piece of work, which is from DEFRA, their website, And again, what they've looked at is solid fuel open fire, which is the worst of all. And it's a little bit difficult to read some of that, but it's basically 3 kilograms per, or 3,000 grams per megawatt hour. A non-DEFRA exempt stove, the eco-design stove, which comes in at 333, which is a dramatic impact. And then a pellet fired boiler, which tend, because you can control pellet stoves that much better and boilers that much better, you can see it comes in lowest of all at 216 grams. So it has, again, a dramatic impact in terms of the appliance you use, not just a fuel type. So that's an important factor to bring in on this. This other piece of work was done, just trying to look, it's German. So in this reference, you can see that it looked at two things, two different types of fuel. One was beech logs and the other was Norway spruce. This is the Norway spruce and this is the beech. And as you can see, as you increase in moisture content, the emissions change quite dramatically. And once you go above 20%, 25%, you can see a quite almost exponential growth in terms of emissions. So again, another piece of basic work that shows the difference in it. This piece of work was done by Air Use, an EU piece of work. And again, this was a comparison of different wood appliances. And it is quite interesting to see the drop off in emissions depending on what you use. You can see an open fireplace is worst at 700. A standard, this would be, we'd assume, a multi-fuel stove, which is again quite high at 450 milligrams. You then drop dramatically when you go into eco-design stoves. Now, the stove here, and both of those come in at 100 and just under 100. And then a range of pellet stoves. You can see now there was one outlier in the pellet stove, which came in at around 60, and then the other pellet stoves and two pellet boilers and one pellet stove come in considerably lower again. And you can see a dramatic impact because of the appliance that you're using. And that is the important thing. If you're going to burn a fuel, you have to understand how it burns and how to burn it correctly. Have an appliance that's designed based on that knowledge. And by doing so, you can have a dramatic impact. This graph is just something, we've taken some information from an Irish context, and also we've taken the European Environmental Agency guidebook on small combustion emission factors. And we've looked again at open fires, old stoves. You can see the efficient stove, eco-label stove, and then your pellet stove. And again, you can see a dramatic reduction in terms of particulate emissions. Now, we're comparing it in this with gas, kerosene, and heat pumps, and you can see they're all next to zero. What's important on this graph, on the two graphs on this page, is what we looked at was, what are the emissions if we were to heat the average domestic house in Ireland and take an SEI's figure of 15,000 kilowatt hours per annum? What are the emissions from that house over the course of an entire year? So of particulates, we'll look at carbon dioxide in a second. But if you look at the particulates, again, from an open fire, you would be producing, and it's a figure we can all grasp, we produce about 44 kilograms of particulate matter per year using an open fire. If we use an eco-design stove, we can reduce that down to 5 kilograms per year. And if we use a pellet stove, we can reduce that down to 1.6. And again, if you look at your gas, it's practically zero. Your heat pumps are zero as well, because it's coming off electricity. This is not looking at the emissions from a power station included in this. This is just at the point of heat use. Now, one factor to take into account there is that particulates in the atmosphere have a life cycle of measured in days, possibly up as far as a week, depending on weather conditions. Wet weather, it tends to be washed out of the atmosphere very quickly within a matter of hours. So in terms of where you're looking at producing, say, with an eco-design stove, 5 kilograms per year, at any one time, the quantity in the atmosphere would have been washed out. What you produced last week would be gone today, but it has been produced all the same. And it doesn't have a long-lasting effect, but it does have a local effect. And I suppose it's important to classify the difference between a local pollutant and a global pollutant. On the other side, we look at CO2 emissions. And as you can see, we've again looked at it across that whole range again. The open fire, in terms of kilograms of CO2 per year, would produce 720 kilograms. And then your efficient stoves will be down as far as 254 for the eco-design stove. And then your pellet stove is slightly higher because pellets need a bit of energy to be produced at 390. Now, comparing that with the two standard fuels we use for heating in Ireland, kerosene, where you're looking at over 4 tons of carbon dioxide per year, gas at a little over 3 tons, and it's worth understanding that the carbon dioxide that we produce remains in the atmosphere. We're basically being told now to look at a 100-year cycle, because effectively we're continually to add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's a carbon store in itself, and we're not taking any out. So the carbon we produce today, or as one person put to us, the carbon we produced in any car journey in our lifetime is still, half of it is still in the atmosphere. Whatever we produce per year, only half is taken out. So, you know, any car journey you've taken in your life, or any time you've heated a house in your life, that carbon, half of it is still in the atmosphere. It's not been removed. So it is a cumulative effect, and it's something we should take account of. In terms of heat pumps, at the moment, we've taken the emission level off the grid, which is at the moment it's a little bit under 400 grams. We ran it, say 560 is the worst it has been at. It runs standard at the moment between 350 and 400. It was 400 2 years ago when we first produced this graph. And then we're looking at heat pumps. If we go on to 2030 and we're able to reduce it down to 200 grams per kilowatt hour, if we go to 70% renewable electricity, we'll get it to 200 or possibly slightly less than that. But as you can see, you're still producing a quantity of carbon dioxide. It is a good reduction, but it is not, you know, there is still a level of carbon dioxide being produced. So it's just to compare that the particulates are extremely important, the pollutants are important, but we also have to realize the reason we're looking at wood fuels is there is nothing out there that will reduce emissions as good as wood fuels in terms of carbon footprint. Now, the different designs of stoves, I just have a picture there of a few different types you can have. You know, there's a whole range and many other, literally hundreds of types of stoves out there in the market. I'll just go through some of the combustion factors in a moment on it. The eco design, which I've discussed already, this is not just a label, it's an EU requirement. It is due to come into force in Ireland from the 1st of January 2022, that any stove that is for sale must be eco design. And the important factor to understand in this, and I'll go through how it works in the next 2 slides, but when we look at eco-design stoves, there is no longer going to be a multi-fuel stove. You cannot design a stove that can burn turf and also burn timber and have it eco-designed, or burn coal products and burn timber, because it's just not, the two of them burn very differently. It's a bit like a petrol and diesel engine. The technology is different, the way you combust them is different. And if you want the level of efficiency, and more importantly, as these figures in the screen showed, the level of particulates being reduced to the requirements here, you cannot do that with any multi-fuel stove that's currently designed. So we really have to look at the eco-design label. To get that, you have to specialize your stove to burn one type of fuel. And it can be quite dramatic, the differences in them. Just to give you a quick run on the stove types. So a multi-fuel stove, we're all quite familiar with it. We've seen plenty of pictures of them. You tend to pile in your fuel, light the fire at the bottom and pile fuel in on top. We will have primary air coming in on top, and often people understand we have these controls in the stove and don't understand what they're about. But primary air comes in from underneath, and it's in direct contact with the fuel and will cause combustion. You pile on your fuel on top and let it burn away, and your emissions go out the chimney. Secondary air comes in on top, and it mixes with the products of combustion. Now, it is very important to understand the difference there, because when we're burning something like coal, it needs primary air because of the chemical makeup of it. It's more carbon than volatiles. So you need a lot of primary air to burn coal and very little secondary air. It doesn't have a lot of volatiles in it. And proper combustion needs that primary air, and also you tend to have a lot more ash from the likes of coal or peat. So you need a large ash pan. In comparison, if you're burning wood fuel, there is the quantity of carbon is very low, and you will see any of the main multi-fuel eco-design stoves that burn wood have no grate at the bottom. There'll be very little air coming from the bottom. They use all secondary air. That allows full combustion within the combustion zone, and it allows much lower emissions as a result. So it's very important to know the difference and why those differences are there. again, just to give an idea, if you're looking at how you'd looking at wood combustion, again, you would use certified fuel, less than 25%. Believe it or not, the way to combust wood fuel is actually to start the fire on top, and when it's dry enough, it will burn down, and you get much better control of the emissions. You're not driving heat up through the fuel itself. It'll combust on top, and you're going to get much better combustion and much cleaner combustion. So we would recommend understanding the difference and understanding that eco-design stoves, when they come in, will have a dramatic impact on that. Now, those stoves are already in the market, but they're a bit more expensive. So wood-only stove or an eco-design stove is an entirely different appliance. And they are on the market, but they will be required as of the 1st of January 2022. So, and again, we're obviously promoting regular maintenance to ensure they're correct. Wood pellet stoves, there are many different types. You have a wood stove boiler in this picture, or wood pellet boiler in this picture, and also here, this is a new type unit, which basically is an oil. You can go out and replace your oil boiler with this, and you fill it with bags rather than looking at large hoppers. And then we're probably all familiar with the small pellet stoves, which are very popular. And because pellets are very easy to burn in terms of in an enclosed environment, your emissions from pellet stoves tend to be a good bit lower than any other type of appliance burning wood. So they are very well designed and very well controlled, and for that reason they're able to control emissions. To go on to what we're looking at here today, and again going on to the current issue in terms of emissions and urban air controls, firewood that's been offered for sale in Ireland at the moment is absolutely atrocious in terms of what you can get in the market. It would not meet any standard. This is, I'll go through a few pictures of some tests we've done. As you can see, this is bags of firewood. You can see the moisture on the inside of the bag. They were extremely wet. Now, I didn't take samples of that and test. It would have been a good thing to do. But these are some samples I took in November of this year from a couple of shops around Tullamore. So I took 2 bags from one shop. As you can see, the moisture content was at 31% from I think that was the clear plastic bag, and then in the green net bag, the moisture content was up on 40%. So like 40% of the fuel is actually water. So first of all, you're not going to get any heat out of it, but second of all, the emissions are going to be horrendous. This is another shop. Sorry, just control that. Within the same town, and it was again at 37% in these bags. So again, extremely high, and not something you can consider as fuel.
Sorry, no, there's a slight delay in your slides moving forward, so just be conscious of that. So if you go, just go back to the second one from with the pictures.
Okay, I'll slow down. I'll just allow it to catch up.
Go back to the previous. That one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Now, if I move now, it'll be jumping back and forth. So I'll just try and let it settle for a second. So currently, I'm on one of the white bags in the picture. So again, that was other samples we took, and it came out at 37%. So very wet material, not what you consider fuel. I'll just let the slide catch up. I'm onto another slide where I've done pictures of these, but it was samples taken in Thurles, taken in Sallins, taken in Mullingar in May and June of last year. And those samples come in at, the best was in Mullingar, 24%, so that was okay. Next was 27% and 31%. So again, there was quite a range, but that was in May and June. And if you remember last year, the weather was quite good, and you're into a time of year when you should be able to at least produce firewood at a low moisture content. But they're not the months when you really want firewood. Now the next slide, I'll just show. I'll give a second to catch up. But it's a visual representation of what you would expect in terms of, people don't understand how much water can actually be in firewood. And I have 2 pictures there. It's the same log, but I'm just giving you a comparison of that log if it had 40% moisture content or if it had 17%. And you can see a dramatic difference in the volume of water. And if you consider you're using that log, and for the first thing it has to do is boil off all that water before it can actually provide any heat to the home. So it's a huge amount of water. There's a much smaller amount when you're looking at 17%, and it's actually, funnily enough, when you're looking at how combustion works, a small amount of water is actually a good thing. When you go below 10%, it actually is a negative effect. So, it can start to have a negative effect in a small way. So it's to do with turbulence and ensuring efficiency. But you can see that there's a huge amount of water in firewood when it's wet, and it's not something that should be used. So the moisture content has a critical impact on efficiency, on air emissions, value for the customer, on the stove maintenance. You know, it'll be corrosive as well. So there are so many reasons why having dry firewood and dry fuel is of critical importance. Kiln dried is often a question we're asked, and really kiln is just a method of drying it down to a certain level. It doesn't matter how it got to that low moisture content once it's at that level. You can use a kiln that's faster, but it takes energy and it takes cost. You can we've people around Ireland producing firewood at under 20%, just using air drying, literally just out in properly stacked, and it works very well. So, but they're well prepared. They will be starting to buy material now for next year, you know, and they have the plan ahead. So a critical component on all this is to use high quality firewood. And I'll go into our proposal later on in a few minutes on this. Our proposal really is, just let the slide catch up on it, is that we have been approaching the Department of Energy for some time, which is all part of the environment at the moment, at this point in time. And we are very strongly advocating that firewood needs to be regulated. You've seen the pictures of those samples of firewood outside shops in Ireland, and they're not firewood, it's not fuel. So we are saying that firewood, like any other fuel, should be regulated. We're calling for the regulation to come into force on the 1st of September of this year. We're looking for the European standard ISO 17225 to be mandatory. And within that, you have different phases for material to be at 25% or 20%. So we to allow industry time to convert, to look at a mandatory level of 25% starting in September of this year, and that's very achievable. And to go for a phase 2 on that, so in the middle of the following heating season, we look at a mandatory requirement of 20%. And by doing so, we're looking at reducing air emissions dramatically. We're also looking at, that's on the fuel side, and that's our strong advocate at the moment. We need to look at proper regulation of wood fuel. Like all other fuels, we need to have a standard in place. The other thing is, as I've spoken in terms of appliances, as we said, the eco-design requirements are coming in. That will be a help, but it'll be a lot slower, obviously, converting people over from old stoves or fireplaces into eco-design stoves. And we're also looking at promotion of the correct use of those stoves, so people understand how to light it correctly and how to fuel it correctly so that you can keep your emissions low. And again, to promote correct maintenance, because if it's maintained correctly, it will have a dramatic impact again in how it's going to work. So again, on that, the critical component for us is the regulation of the sale of all firewood starting on the 1st of September 2021. Now, just on these slides, which will be available afterwards, we have other sources of information: Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme, which we run, woodenergy.ie, which is run through the Department of Agriculture. A lot of good information on that. And then there's other sources of information, such as the EPA in the US, the Burn Wise program, and DEFRA in the UK also has good advice on open fires and wood burning stoves. Or you can look at Bioenergy Europe, which is the European-wide body for bioenergy, obviously enough, and they have good advice on their website. That's basically it. We see a number of questions coming in there, so and we'll have time to go through those. So that's basically it. Again, our point really is that we need to see proper regulation of firewood, and we would hope to, and that would in itself would have a dramatic impact on changing the emissions that are coming out of people using wood fuels.
Okay, thanks very much, Noel, for your presentation. And as you said, there are a number of questions which have come in. So if you can maybe stop or go back to your, yeah, that's fine. So we'll start off and we'll run through some of the questions. So the first one is just a comment, I suppose, from Robert, and thanks very much, Robert, for your comment. To say that he's been working with UCD and the author of the report, so that would be the report that you referred to at the start, Noel, of the presentation, to further test fuels and stoves with better atmospheric particulate analysis, and the paper has been submitted. So thanks for informing us of that, Robert, and certainly maybe we might be able to get you on to a future webinar to further discuss this particular topic. Noel, the first question for you then, in from Elizabeth. and I think this question came in when you were discussing about the difference in the PM2.5 and the CO2. Various wood briquette products are on the market, usually with a moisture level of under 6%. What fuel would they be equivalent to? So I just note that your charts don't reference wood briquettes, but
no, and there is quite a lot of wood briquettes on the market. So really, I suppose the comparison there, I would probably make it similar to firewood in that you're burning it in a similar appliance. They are like wood pellets would be around the same level at 6% to 8%. So their wood briquettes are in many ways a large wood pellet, and you can compare them on that. But because you're burning them in a stove, I would say you're probably closer to firewood emissions, very dry firewood emissions, than you would be to pellet.
Okay, thanks, Noel. And then just a follow-on question from Elizabeth, and it's one which is interesting, and if you could elaborate on. I'm very surprised at the CO2 levels for heat pumps. Why is SEI supporting them over dry firewood-pellet stoves? So maybe if you could put up that slide, actually, Noel, if you have it there, maybe just share that slide just to explain that further.
So, 1 second now. So yeah, one moment now. Get it. I presume you can see that there now.
It hasn't come up yet, but it's starting to share. Yeah, if you just go back to the slide, it's probably slide 6 or 7, I think, is it?
It is. It's
and go to presentation mode. If you can. Yeah.
No, you can let me know when it's caught up there.
Hasn't come up yet.
Really, the SEI, they have promoted heat pumps, and they're a good technology. I suppose what they're looking at is if we can get to a situation in 15 years' time where we have a lot more renewable electricity on the grid, that level of emissions will be slowly lowered over time. So, but it is a factor to take into account. And look, if we're going to do all heat pumps and if we're going to do all electric cars, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the grid. You know, there's a focus on electrifying everything. We would advocate that there is a need for all technologies to be brought into the mix here. We have a huge task ahead of us in replacing gas and kerosene. Fossil fuels have been very cheap and very plentiful, but they're not, as we know now, they're not good for us at all. So, but we cannot, there's no silver bullet to replace them. We do need a mix of many technologies, and heat pumps often coupled with high levels of insulation will reduce that dramatically as well. So it's look, they do have a place, a strong place, but yeah, when you're comparing them in terms of production per kilowatt hour, their emissions are a good bit higher. So, but there are other factors, and they are part of the mix.
And just as a follow-on from that, Noel, there are many houses that wouldn't be up to the insulation standards or maybe the air tightness standards in terms of a heat pump. What are the potential solutions for those type of houses?
Yeah, it's something we're doing a heat plan at the moment, which we hope to have published in this quarter between ourselves there and Renewable Energy Ireland, which is a mix of all the different renewable technologies. And it really is clearly showing the need for all these technologies. But heat pumps suit homes and buildings that are made to be efficient. So high levels of insulation where you don't need high temperatures going through radiators. Generally underfloor heating works well with it. But there is a huge amount of buildings out there that are not going to be suitable for heat pumps because the demands are too high, because the circulation temperature needs to be above 60 degrees. And the only option we have for those is wood fuel. And that's, again, more so than, it might not necessarily be stoves, it could be boilers, pellet boilers or wood chip boilers, especially for those large houses that are at an age and where the cost of converting them and insulating them is far too high. You know, if you're talking about spending more than 60,000, 70,000 euros to insulate the house, you know, the costs there are dramatic in terms of cost per ton of carbon saved. So it really is something that we need to look at many different technologies to solve the problem.
Okay, moving on, Noel, I think you can leave that slide up because there's probably a couple of other questions which kind of refer back to some of the points raised on that slide. A question from Philip, and thanks Philip for your attendance. What changes will there be to building regulations with eco stoves? Will a ventilation hole still be required to punch through retrofit external insulation, and in brackets carbon monoxide? So
most eco-design stoves, or any that I'm aware of, you have a dedicated air source in it. Now, what you need to do, and a dedicated line for bringing in air, not from the room, but through a pipe coming in from outside. So you'd have a ventilation pipe specifically put in place, and you see it in many houses now. And I've walked into houses where people did not know much about stoves, but sitting in the floor where the stove was going to be was a pipe coming in from outside, because it's seen as a requirement. But the idea is you would have a separate line bringing air into the stove, and then it's going straight up, obviously, the chimney. So dedicated ventilation for the stove in itself.
That chimney could be just a metal stack going out through the wall or through the roof?
It can often just be a flue pipe, yes, going out through a wall. Many occasions that's all that's needed. Like, obviously we're all used to the traditional chimney, but really and truly we build a chimney for design, but inside it is a case-lined metal flue, which doesn't really need a chimney around it. It just needs to be sticking up to a certain height. But I suppose the question here is in terms of ventilation. The ventilation we would advise in most situations, it's not going to come from the room itself. It is the term used here is hermetically sealed. So your stove is going to be completely independent to the air in the house. The only time there'll be an exchange is when you open the door. So it's really and truly a separate air system.
So that eliminates any issues with carbon monoxide then because of the...
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Noel. The next question is from Brian. And again, this is something which is raised quite regularly, and something which a number of our members would have a concern about. But if regulation is introduced, what would the plan be to police the regulation? Because regulation is generally useless unless it's managed. So can you just give an outline all of how it would be policed, and I suppose the importance of getting the regulation in place itself?
First and foremost is that there's nothing to police at the moment. So you can, there's nothing, you're doing nothing wrong by selling wet firewood at the minute. So first of all, we do need a regulation in place, but policing it should be the job of the local authority in the very same way as we have regulation of coal products. And if you go into your coal merchant, now the policing there quite often they'll ask you, where are you living within the zone or out of the zone? But we do need to see local authorities to step up to this. If they want to see reductions in the air emissions, they are going to have to stand by the regulations that are put in place.
Okay, and I suppose just Noel, can you outline your engagement with the various different multiple retailers and how the introduction of regulation would be important? And I know that there's issues around...
we have had a number of the multiples we certify wood fuels through the WFQA, and a number of the multiples now are requiring certification of the fuel, even though they're not required. But if you bring in a regulation that you need to have a standard on firewood, really and truly, those larger multiples will take it on because they don't want to be caught out doing something illegal. So and many petrol stations with an interesting situation a couple of years ago where, and more to do with from a regulatory point of view, from a tax point of view, where we understand revenue were going around petrol stations asking where were they getting the firewood, and if they couldn't explain where they were getting it, i.e. if it was coming from a source that wasn't tax registered, then the entire petrol station was getting an audit. So they very quickly ensured that any supplier that they had was certified. And things like that can have a dramatic effect very quickly. So and the retailers themselves, they don't want to be caught out doing something that they're not supposed to be doing for one product. So that in itself, it won't eliminate everything, but it will have a dramatic effect.
So just to summarize what you're saying, Noel, the regulation is the first step, which is very, very important. Policing, obviously, of it and its implementation is very, very important, but that the retailers will automatically move to material which is within the regulation, so that they wouldn't be found out or wouldn't become an issue if they were to be using material that was okay. That's quite clear. The next question again is from Elizabeth. Kiln dried wood seems to have a low moisture content, but especially in counties along the border when it comes from Northern Ireland. How does Brexit impact on the standards? So is there any impact on the standards as a result of Brexit?
Yeah, one kiln would have low moisture content because it's obviously, the kiln is designed to get it to a certain level. But as I said, we can, many of our suppliers do use kilns, but it is also possible to do it at air drying if it's correctly done. So absolutely, kiln is good, but it's not the only. So we wouldn't say all firewood should go to a kiln. We'd be very clear about that. We are saying it's not that it needs to go through to a kiln; it needs to be at a certain moisture content, and that's the critical component. In terms of material coming in from Northern Ireland, I'm not sure what impact it's going to have. In terms of there is standards in the UK. We are looking at, like, the retailers here will be subject to the standards that are set here, not UK standards. So, and we are certifying a number of suppliers in Northern Ireland as well who supply material to here. So, in terms of the border control, in terms of any taxation or anything that comes about from transporting goods, to be honest with you, I don't have information on that at the minute. But the standard, whatever standard we set here, any material that comes in from Northern Ireland or parts of Europe, and we see some pellets coming in from different parts of Europe, that will be required to meet standard.
Okay, just an interesting comment there from Robert, just on the policing aspect, that he works in the solid fuel sector and that there is no enforcement currently of the legislation around sulfur smoky coal, but the large retailers will embrace regulation, whereas the smaller ones won't. So I think that's a point.
Yeah, I note that there is a policing issue there. But I suppose from our point of view, we would like to have that problem on our table, because at least we can then address it. But
Okay.
The problem for us on the table is we have no regulation at the minute.
Following on, Noel, a point here from Charlie, which I'd like you to comment on. It would be impossible to police timber being sold directly to the household. So could you just comment on that? Obviously, a regulation would address maybe. Yeah,
it's it's buyer beware. I mean, but the only thing is, at the moment, the householder there's no regulation for them to look at. There is no requirement for a standard. And yes, they are issues we do see coming down the road if we get to regulation. But I suppose, as I'm pointing out, without having a regulation in place in the first place, there are issues we can't address. So, but if the householders become more aware of what's required, and invariably householders that are using a lot of firewood get to know that dry firewood is far better than wet firewood. So, that there's a certain level of knowledge that goes along with it.
So an ongoing awareness and I suppose information campaign would be required
yes.
To coincide with the
once we get the regulation in place, it's a case of we do need to follow that up with public information.
Okay, Noel, another question here for you. It's in from Jerome, and it's to do with pellets. Is pellet fuel cost and security of supply an issue? I know we have some of our pellet members on the webinar this morning, so do you just want to comment on that?
Yeah, supply is not an issue at all. We've 2 mills in the country. I understand there may be another one going to be built. And in terms of cost, pellets are a little bit more expensive than firewood in many cases, but in terms of its efficiency, in terms of overall, and especially when you start bringing carbon tax into it, its comparison with fossil fuels is quite good. So, it's the cost I wouldn't see as a major factor on it.
Okay, a question here from Owen. At the start of the presentation, you presented PM 2.5 figures from various types of stoves and open fires. How dependent are these on the techniques of the person operating the stove? So how important is that in the...
It is a factor in terms of, now, as I said earlier on, how you light a stove has a big impact on the emissions at startup. So lighting it at the top of putting fuel in and then lighting on top, which is totally alien to me, to be honest, for something I've never done until recent years. So I'm sure it is to a lot of people, but that is actually how you light firewood. And so those sort of techniques, and it prevents that glut of smoke that you tend to see at the start of combustion for the first few minutes. Those sort of techniques are important. So how the operator does it is a factor, and that they're using, again, that the operator is picking the right fuel, that they're buying correct fuel is another factor on it. The only real technique is you're also looking at how often do you fuel it, and it's not a good thing to let a fire die down completely and then fill it up a huge amount. The best way of fueling a fire is little and often. But again, so that technique is probably something that could be promoted to people at large.
Okay. Another question, and if you have any final questions, if you could submit them as soon as possible. That we're just coming to close to the end of our webinar this morning. So a question from Andy here, Noel. What percentage of the solid fuel market is now taken up by wood products? And would you have any breakdown then in terms of how that breaks down in terms of pellets stroke firewood? So maybe have you got any figures or any idea of the percentage?
No, we were trying to get an answer to that question last year, and to be honest, I don't have a figure at the top of my head, but I do know it's a particularly difficult question to answer, largely due to there's a lot of activity out there that's not regulated, or that's not marked down anywhere. So, for example, there's a lot of peat turf for sale and being used that's not documented. There's a lot of firewood that's been used that's not documented. So it is a little bit difficult, but we do know that in terms of solid fuel, the firewood market is growing considerably. The anecdotal evidence that we have from our suppliers is that those numbers are going up quite considerably. We would also know that pellet stoves, more so than your pellet boilers, the pellet stove that use bags, and this is the information we're getting from suppliers of fuel, the market has moved over to bags quite a lot over the last couple of years, and that's indicative of, as we talk to installers of pellet stoves, they are very, very busy and have been for the last 2 years. Pellet stoves have become very popular, and as a result, the amount of bag product being sold has increased dramatically in the country over the last couple of years.
Okay, and just an input there from Eugene to say that the Department of Agriculture Wood Flow has data on wood fuel use. So if anyone would like to look into that, so it's the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine website, Wood Flow, and it is data on the wood fuel usage. Noel, moving on, we're coming to the end. There's still a couple of questions left. Hopefully we'll get to deal with them all. A question from Jonathan. How can you check if an already installed stove is in compliance with eco-design standards for wood combustion to meet new requirements that will be introduced from 2022?
You'd have to just check the nameplate, get the model number and nameplate, and go online and see if you can get that information. I would say it's the only way of doing that. And the manufacturer should have that information online, or should have a certificate online if it is meeting eco-design. Now, from 2022, they're not going to tell you have to take out your stove if it doesn't meet eco-design. It means if you're buying a new stove from 2022, it'll have to be eco-design.
Okay, that's an important point to make.
Yeah.
From Brian here, it's probably more of a comment that he sees regulation as not working for solid fuel and is driving the growth of illicit fuels. So that's a comment. I suppose just as a follow-up point to that, the difference in wood fuels and the regulation of wood fuels, it's in the context of the importance from an air emissions perspective. And maybe Noel, if you could further expand on that.
I would also add something as well. We have for many years been, for example, we would have presented a lot at the Ideal Homes show. We've done several years in a row at that show, and it was interesting over those years. Now this is going from about 2012 up to 2018, and the customers over those years gotten more and more knowledgeable. You know, we would meet literally thousands of people at that show every year. We would have 4 or 5 people on the stand flat out for 4 days. It was a very busy show for us. And we done it to promote use of wood fuel and the WFQA. And people were coming to us after a couple of years saying you have to get the firewood dry. Whereas at the start we were telling them, in the latter couple of years they were telling us as they came up to the stand. So it was very interesting to hear that. But unlike, say, coal, where you're looking at the quality issue is sulfur, and this is an example, the customer it doesn't make a huge lot of difference into how it's going to burn, whether there's sulfur in it or not. But when it comes to firewood, the thing we want here is dry fuel, and it has a dramatic impact on how that works for the consumer and the amount of heat you'll get out of it. Now, we have a video on our website, if you want to look at it, where we took samples of firewood at 40% and at, I think it was 25%, and burnt them in 2 identical stoves. We went down to Waterford Stanley. They set up 2 identical stoves, made sure there was the same back pressure and everything on the 2 stoves. And there was a dramatic difference I was actually quite shocked by the difference in how those 2 fuels burnt at 40% and 25%. You couldn't get heat out of the 40% material, whereas 25 was roasting hot in no time. So the customer experience from using dry fuel will drive customers to look for quality fuel. Whereas that's not the case in other regulated markets where you're looking at things that they don't see, like sulfur.
Okay, Noel. Another follow-on point or question here, and again, it's from Elizabeth, referencing the policing. Would a higher tax on high moisture wood have a bigger impact, I'm sure, and be less onerous on local authorities in terms of impact? I suppose
the issue there would be that high moisture wood and material that's been sold at, let's just say, a crossroads isn't taxed anyway in many situations. There's a lot of firewood out there that's not being taxed that we're trying to get regulated as well. And part of what we're trying to do here is by bringing it into some form of regulation. And if you want to avail of we have looked at different mechanisms. Could you have a tax back program or something like that to try and give those people that are legitimately operating an advantage over those that are operating in an illegal market? Now, the legal market was a big problem 5-6 years ago when employment was a lot higher, unemployment was a lot higher, and you had people going out with chainsaws becoming firewood suppliers overnight, which was usually, and I'm happy enough to say it was usually stolen. I'm happy enough to, I'm confident to say that it was usually stolen from state forests. So those operators have largely disappeared, so it's not so much an issue. But yeah, higher taxation on high moisture content could have an impact. But who's going to police that as well? And who's going
but we want to get rid of high moisture content, Noel. We don't want high moisture content.
Yeah, well, that's true. We just want it shouldn't be there in the first place. You know, it shouldn't be for sale.
Wouldn't work. There's just a couple of final questions here, and one from Helen. And again, maybe we can conclude on this. Do you have any information about internal air quality? I've seen suggestions that the refueling of stoves, opening the door, significantly reduces air quality in room with potential health implications. So, do you want to comment on that, Noel?
Yeah, one of the newspapers done their own bit of research on this over the Christmas period, which we came across. There is look, if you're going to leave a stove open, or it depends on how you're going to fuel it, you could have escape of emissions to the room. But in fairness, if people are operating things correctly and fueling it correctly, that's not going to be an issue. An anecdotal thing on people that burn a lot of, I originally came from an area that burnt a lot of sod peat. They would see a lot of dust around the house as a result. But you will find that that's not so much the case when it comes to your wood stove. If you see large increases of dust in your house, you might want to question how you're fueling the stove and if there's an issue there. But if you have a properly maintained chimney, you have a good draft on that chimney, and when you open that door, it means that the air has been drawn into the fire rather than coming out at you. So again, this comes down to maintenance. If you don't have your chimney clean and it's not able to draw away the flue as efficiently as it should, then that could become a problem. If you have emissions coming back out at you when you open the door, that's the first thing I would suspect that needs to be addressed. There should be enough draft within that fire draw air in when you open the door rather than let stuff out.
Okay, I suppose just we're at our time. We're slightly over our time. So I'd like to thank all of the attendees this morning, and thank you very much for your questions. And also thanks for your comments. We got a number of comments that the webinar was very informative and that people have learned a lot from having participated. So a key part of our work is to provide information so that everyone is clear on, I suppose, firstly, what work we're doing on behalf of our members, but also what the issues are out there and how they can be addressed. I'd like to thank all of our participants for logging on. I'd like to also thank Noel for his work in preparing the presentation and for presenting this morning and his ongoing work in the association on behalf of the members through the WFQA and indeed on all the other sectors. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Teresa O'Brien in getting all of this set up, in advertising the webinars, in setting up the all of the background Zoom links and all of that. So thanks very much, Teresa, for your ongoing work and efforts to make these webinars successful. And just a final reminder that the recording of this webinar is available or will be available in the coming days on our website. So if anyone would like to look back over the webinar video, we'd be happy for you to do that, and also to share it with any colleagues which might be interested in looking at it as well. So at that, we'll say thank you all, and we look forward to having you online again in 2 weeks' time for our next webinar. So until then, take care, stay safe, and Happy New Year to you all. Thank you.